Every person who takes the job of President of the United States leaves his mark on the office. There are six I will discuss here: George Washington, who defined the presidency; John Adams, who kept America from crumbling from war; Thomas Jefferson, who expanded the United States; James Madison, who kept America safe from the War of 1812; James Monroe, who created the Monroe Doctrine; and Andrew Jackson, who brought our national debt down to zero. These men not only defined their own presidencies, but they formed a nation. George Washington is generally considered to be the father of our country, and was first to do many things for the United States. His presidency was from 1789 to 1797. His main accomplishment was being the first president of the United States. Washington set the standard for a presidential cabinet. He included Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State; Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury; Henry Knox, Secretary of War; and Edmund Randolph, Attorney General. Among many of his accomplishments, Washington worked with Alexander Hamilton to create a national bank of the United States. Washington was also instrumental in the design and construction of Washington, D.C. The president hired Pierre L'Enfant as the architect of the city. Ironically, he was the only president to not live in the White House. First president, Washington defined what it meant to be president. An example of this is how he handled the Whiskey Rebellion, a tax protest in 1791. It was intended to generate revenue to help reduce the national debt. When protests arose in western Pennsylvania, Washington balanced use of force with federal troops, with reconciliation using commissioners. This balanced action showed how he intended to deal with people who did not follow the law. Washington's final major act as a president was to step down because he wanted to go back to his plantation in Virginia and farm, and second, he felt power did not belong in one man's hands alone. John Adams was a one-term president from 1797 to 1801. Adams' biggest accomplishment was called the XYZ Affair, where France was seizing American trading ships. Adams sent envoys to France to try and reason with the French authorities, which failed. In the end, France demanded money from the Americans. This was seen as an insult to the Americans. Adams, however, continued the diplomatic process to an eventual success. This kept the United States out of war with France. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 are considered to be the downfall of Adams' presidency. They made it harder for an immigrant to become a citizen, allowed the president to imprison and deport non-citizens who were deemed dangerous or who were from a hostile nation, and criminalized making false statements that were critical of the federal government. People could not speak out against the government under penalty of arrest. Adams created the American Navy in May of 1798 and is considered the father of the American Navy. Thomas Jefferson was president from 1801 to 1809. He was a Democratic Republican whose main ideals were to strictly follow the Constitution. The highlight of the Jefferson presidency was the case Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison goes back to when Adams was in office. John Adams appointed many judges when he was in office because he wanted the Federalists, his party, to have a significant power in the government. When the officials in the government are appointed, they get a commission. This commission is basically a job description. When Adams appointed these people, he was still in office. However, when he left office, these commissions had yet to be delivered. When Jefferson became president, his Secretary of State was James Madison. The Secretary of State was supposed to deliver these commissions. Jefferson, knowing it would be bad for his government, told Madison not to deliver the commissions, which would go against the Constitution because he would be taking charge of the judicial branch, which takes away checks and balances. The end result was the concept called judicial review. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was the largest single acquisition of land by the United States and continued to fulfill the idea of manifest destiny. This purchase was met with great resistance in Jefferson's political party because it is unconstitutional to acquire any territory. Jefferson agreed that the U.S. Constitution did not contain explicit provisions for acquiring territory, but he asserted that his constitutional power to negotiate treaties was sufficient. James Madison's presidency was from 1809 to 1817. Most of his presidency was consumed by the War of 1812. The United States declared war for several reasons, including trade restrictions brought about by the British war with France, the impressment of American merchant sailors into the Royal Navy, and British support for Native American tribes fighting settlers on the frontier, and interest in the United States expanding its border west. The war ended when the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814. This treaty began an era of peaceful relations between the U.S. and Great Britain. James Monroe was president from 1817 to 1825. The main accomplishment of his was the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. policy told European nations that America would no longer tolerate further colonization in North or South America or puppet monarchs. From 1829 to 1837, Andrew Jackson was president. Jackson was an American general who was most famous for eliminating the national bank created during the Washington presidency. Give up its land east of the Mississippi River and migrate west. The Cherokee people called this migration the Trail of Tears because of its devastating effects. In 1835, the Jackson administration paid off the national debt. This lasted 1 year. In Jackson's mind, debt was a moral failing. To do that, he took advantage of a huge real estate bubble that was raging in the western U.S. The federal government owed a lot of western land, and Jackson started selling it off. He was also ruthless on the budget. He blocked every spending bill he could. On January 30th, 1835, Richard Lawrence attempted to assassinate Jackson. It was determined that Lawrence was mentally unstable, and he spent the rest of his life in a mental institute. Jackson believed this was an attempt by his political enemies because he was in the process of dismantling the national bank.